So tonight's speaker is Michael Wilpers. He joined FOSC in 2004 and was quickly volunteered to the chair of the Natural History Committee. In 2010, he completed his certificate in natural history field studies from Audubon Naturalist Society, which is now Nature Forward. He served as president of FOSC from 2010 to 2013, and afterwards continued to edit the FOSC newsletter for another 10 years. He's been active in our Frog Watch program, nature outings, wildlife inventories, the Powerline Meadow, kiosks, and advocating for deer culling. After retiring in 2022, he joined the advocacy committee and helped with a successful fight to prevent a gas station being built next to the creek at Riggs Road. He also works with the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club on legislation in Annapolis. So with that, I will turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, Elaine, and welcome everybody to tonight's program. The topic, as you know, early botany in Sligo, 1876 to 1920. Most of it will be devoted to the 1890s to about 1915. I was inspired to launch into this research when I learned that, Laura Mull initiated a great project to honor the 20th anniversary of the publication on our website of John Parrish and R.G. Steinman's Native Plants of the Sligo Creek Watershed, which was published on our website 2003. And Claire Garman, the late Claire Garman, was the webmaster, and it provided a comprehensive listing of 372 species of shrubs, wildflowers, grasses, rushes, sedges, trees, and for me, it played an important part in my getting to know the flora of Sligo Creek Watershed, because if I was in the iNaturalist days, if I'm using a field guide and I see a plant, I think I know what it is, I could easily look up the inventory. I could search it by any Latin name, common name, and if it didn't occur in Sligo Creek, according to John Parrish, I knew I had the ID wrong. On the other hand, if it did appear, I could feel like, all right, and it maybe I was on target. Not only did it list all the species, it also told us which sections of Sligo the plant occurred in, of the 9 sections that the Friends of Sligo Creek divided the watershed into. So that was also extremely handy. And he would indicate if it was rare, common, abundant, fairly rare, extremely rare, and what kind of habitat it grew in, whether a floodplain, dry hillside, ridgetop, and a trail along the trail side, open meadows, and so forth. A really invaluable contribution to understanding of the watershed, certainly for me, and I imagine for others. Here's the original homepage from 2003 for the inventory. It's, of course, on our current website. So Laura and John Parrish are working hard on a second edition, which will update all the scientific names, which have undergone lots of changes because of molecular DNA analysis. It'll put everything in the right taxonomic categories. Again, those have changed for quite a few plants based on the same research. And it'll include sightings of some of the new species that have been confirmed since 2003, and some new locations where previous plants were shown not to have occurred that now we know they do occur. So here's how we're going to break down the evening. Here are the 3 basic topics. How did Sligo become very well studied? And I'm just going to say it was very well studied. There was no comprehensive flora of Sligo written during that period, but a lot of outstanding botanists, at least 40 by my count, visited the Sligo watershed up before 1920. So how did it come to be? There were so many botanists interested, available to come here. How did they get here, and what drew them here? And then I'll pick out a few of my favorites of the active botanists from that time and provide a little bit of good news, which we all need about habitats. I'll just show you what you're looking at here. At the bottom center is the label for the plant that's directly above it, Arctic reedgrass, which we'll learn more about later. And you see on the label, the collector has written Sandy Swamp near Tacoma Park, DC. And that's a Homer D. House botanist, and we'll investigate that. Upper right is Agnes Chase, world-class grasses expert, who will meet and learn something about. Lower right, a DC streetcar, which the streetcars played a huge role in getting botanists access, not only to Sligo, but to natural areas all over the DC area. Now, many of you probably, some of you probably don't think in terms of watersheds, and a map of watershed can be a little bit confusing because it doesn't follow streets or jurisdictional lines. So here's the Sligo watershed and the 4 basic areas we're going to discuss. On the left-hand side is basically Georgia Avenue. It rides on a ridge between the Sligo and Rock Creek watersheds, going from northwest to southeast. And on the right-hand side is basically University Boulevard. This is at least for the northern 2/3 of the watershed. University Boulevard is also on a ridge and separates Sligo watershed from the northwest branch. That's a very rough way of describing it. So if I go back quickly, now if you look at this label and you say it's near Tacoma Park, DC. Okay, not really that helpful, although it narrows it down to some degree. A lot of the labels of these 700 or 650 or so specimens at the Smithsonian Herbarium and the University of Maryland Herbarium have labels like that. So, but there are 2. Well, that's the ones that basically say Tacoma Park, DC, Sligo, DC, and so forth. I'll all cover those or select a few of them for that center area, Tacoma Park, DC, and so forth. 2 of our collectors were ventured away from that area and collected a lot of plants. One of them, where they're all labeled near the Sligo, 2 miles north of Tacoma. And that's probably either side of Forest Glen Road. And another, the botanist, collected from, consistently, he labeled the plants as the Sligo below Tacoma Park. And some of them include the additional line near the mouth of the Sligo. And then lastly, we'll look at the Tacoma bog where it might have existed, because that was a major draw. So the first question is, how did it come to be that there were so many botanists available to come study in Sligo? Like I said, at least 40 visited before 1920. One reason was the establishment of the National Herbarium, the Smithsonian. And the National Herbarium was built on the collection made in the so-called Wilkes expedition of 1838 to 42. That's just 2 years after Darwin wrote his Voyage of the Beagle in 1836. They went all around South America and the South Pacific, and they had 2 botanists on board. And over the course of those 4 years, they collected 50,000 specimens, about 10,000 species, and that's formed the original collection of the National Herbarium. So what were we going to do with that collection? In 1846, Congress created the U.S. National Museum, now known as Smithsonian, with a gift of $54,000 from the estate of the British scientist James Smithson, who never came to the U.S., gave it to his nephew, who had no children, and the instructions were to give it to the U.S. government with a very simple mission for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men, of course. So that was worth about $2 billion today. It's a pretty amazing endowment. So they quickly got to work. It took a while to finish building the Smithsonian Castle, which we're all familiar with, and there it is in 1864. And in 1850, those 50,000 specimens from the Wilkes expedition were sent to the castle, but they were just left there. Nobody curated them. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is another main draw of bringing botanists to the DC area. It was created in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, 8 employees. It was during a period of tremendous growth in the U.S. government in all areas. In 1868, they had a few more employees. They moved into that building on the left, and they used a great swath of the mall to experiment with farm plants. In 1881, the National Museum transferred the uncurated National Herbarium to the USDA Agricultural Museum, which, as far as I can tell, was somewhere inside that building. In 1894, the herbarium materials were moved back to the castle and officially transferred to the care of the Smithsonian. And now some more, another familiar building. In 1910, the U.S. National Museum, that is open to the public, opened on the mall. It later became the National Museum of Natural History, and the herbarium was transferred there. Now, I included this picture on the lower left, not only because it's a picture of the building in the same year, 1909, but because we're going to talk about transportation, it's worth noting that nothing but horses are the mode of transportation for pulling things and getting around. So here's some citations about the abundance of botanists who came to Washington in 1881, the very first significant flora of Washington, written by Frank L. Ward, 1881. He says, in the investigation of the flora of Washington, so many able and active botanists and so many energetic amateurs have cooperated, it would seem almost invidious to single out any as the subjects of special thanks. I should say he does go on to thank several immediately after saying that. And in a report in 1918 for the Journal of Washington Academy of Sciences, they say that the years 1884 marked the beginning of a very large increase in the number of botanists in the District of Columbia due to the increase in the staff of the Department of Agriculture. And then finally, 1910, a report of the Washington Botanical Society, they said that our list of members gives an indication of the botanical activity of Washington and marks it as the greatest botanical center in the world. So with that in place, it's easier to imagine why 40 of them would have found their way to Sligo. And here's where the National Herbarium is now. It's at the Smithsonian Natural Museum of Natural History. It does have its own identity as the National Herbarium. Now they have 5 million plant specimens, and they have a special dedicated herbarium for the District of Columbia, which now covers the DC Baltimore area, 2,800 species. So how did all these botanists get around without cars, in a lot of cases without roads? In 1873, the B&O Railroad opened the Metropolitan Branch, which ran from DC to Point of Rocks, almost to Harper's Ferry. And there were a number of stops along the Sligo watershed. Scott at Riggs Road, Lamond, not next to a road, Brentwood, later became Tacoma Park, Carroll Avenue, North Tacoma, Silver Spring, Linden, and Forest Glen. And it was 10 years later, City of Tacoma Park was founded and then incorporated shortly thereafter. That's the Tacoma Station in 1910. So here, just to give you a view of how it looked at the time, the Metropolitan Branch, 7 stops along the western boundary. 5 of them stopped at roads. Now, let's see if you can see my cursor. Silver Spring Station, a road going directly to Sligo, and Forest Glen, that we'll talk about later. That's Forest Glen Road. Here's Sligo Creek. You see Sligo Branch, they're calling it at that time. And here's the area that the one botanist explored in some detail, and that's the Forest Glen Station. And then some other stops. Here's further south, North Tacoma Station. I don't know if it was a station at the time. Here, Lamond and Scott. Now, Scott will become, it may have been the station where the other botanist who explored Lower Sligo got off and walked again up just about 1.5 miles, and there's Sligo Branch. Northwest Branch is not labeled correctly here because the confluence is not that far north. But so it was easy to walk down Riggs Road. In fact, there are some specimens in these collections from a Delphi mill, which is also on Riggs Road, and presumably they walk there too. And that's quite a bit further. Another point that we'll get to, here's the Lamond Station, which Metro didn't pick up. It's not near a road, but this is one of the sites that we think maybe the Sligo Bog, which Tacoma Bog, a big draw to botanists, it would have been located, and they could have easily walked from Lamond Station. So later, streetcars came into fore. This is about 15 years after the train opened, and really closer to the time when the really intense botanical exploration of Sligo began. So here, 1888, the Brightwood Railway Company from down DC up Georgia Avenue, and they had stops also at Silver Spring and Forest Glen. 1897, a much smaller route from 4th and Butternut in Tacoma, DC, through Tacoma Park to Elm Avenue, and near what today is Heather Avenue, came to be known later as Glen Sligo. And within 2 years, 2 years later, 4 botanists went to labeled their plants as from Glen Sligo, where this hotel opened a year later. So they took advantage of that trolley, presumably. Just to give you an idea of how extensive the trolley system was, I don't have a date on this map. It could be at the very peak, maybe in the 40s. I don't know, but my mother rode she loved riding the streetcars all over, and that would have been in the 30s. So in 1919, Hitchcock and Stanley, two prominent botanists, published Flora of the District of Columbia and vicinity, and they devote quite a few pages to how to get around to good collecting grounds, they call them, and they discuss which exactly trolleys to take to get to which areas: Cabin John, Great Falls, Rockville, Rock Creek Park, Beltsville for the powder mill bogs, including Mount Vernon. They do go ahead to point out, as you see at the bottom, that the upper valleys of Paint Branch and the Northwest Branch could be reached only by what they call special conveyance. Now, I don't know if that's a friend with a really good horse or someone who happened to have one of the early cars, most likely an early car. This is probably more detailed than we know, but in 1905, the major trolley to DC closed. Part of it was revived, but it stopped at the Maryland line. For 10 years, 1918, 27, there's a new trolley ran from Tacoma Station to Sligo Creek down Carroll Avenue to the sanatorium, now called later called Washington Adventist Hospital. But between those periods, the botanist named E.S. Steele still managed to collect 5 plants at where he called at the sanatorium when there was no trolley. All right, so what drew them here? This is the map we've already looked at. The major draw was probably the Tacoma Bog. It didn't have that name most of this period, but bogs were very attractive, if nothing else, because they supported orchids. In our samples and our labels of the specimens we'll look at, some are said to come from a sand swamp, a sphagnum swamp, probably both are the Tacoma Bog. Then we'll look, like I mentioned, first at 2 other areas: the Sligo, near the Sligo, 2 miles north of Tacoma, and the Sligo below Tacoma. So that area around Forest Glen Road was explored only by this botanist, Charles L. Pollard. He's one of the very few of all these botanists who was not from the rural Midwest. He was born in New York City, and he was, as you see, assistant curator for USDA for a while. Then he moved to the Smithsonian. There's a lot of back and forth between the USDA and Smithsonian. In 4 years, he visited Sligo 10 times. Now, it occurred to me the other day that perhaps he lived in Sligo and or nearby. That would take more research than I had time for. He was editor of Plant World for a long time, co-founder of the Washington Biologist Field Club, which became really the prominent field botany organization. They eventually established an outpost on Plummer's Island in the Potomac River. He then moved on to a museum in Staten Island. He, on the left there, he's the young guy, and on the right is Albert Hitchcock, Albert S. Hitchcock, who co-wrote the 2 of them co-wrote the 1919 Flora of Washington vicinity. So Pollard, in addition to collecting 2 miles north of the Sligo, he collected a total of 122 specimens, 37 species. In fact, he's the only one who collected a sweet bay magnolia, which is the namesake tree of the magnolia bog that we'll be talking about later. But he also collected lots of bog witchgrass, which grows only in bogs, as far as I know, and these 4 other: swamp azalea, staggerbush, swamp dewberry, swollen sedge. They could have all been from the Sligo bog, but the labels are just Tacoma or Tacoma, DC, or something like that. So here's from the Forest Glen area. Like I mentioned, there's the Forest Glen train station, or it could have been the trolley line, and there's the road leading to the green area, the area in the green circle. Here's a sample label where you can see how he specified, and it's that, by the standards of the day, this is really specific. I have to say, thank God for that. So here's an aerial view today. Of course, the Beltway now cuts through it. It's heavily forested and part of Sligo Creek Park. John Parrish, who's on the call right now, has looked over the entire list of all the plants that he collected that one day. And here's a few of them: 10-angled pipewort, American marsh pennywort, seed box, Virginia meadow beauty, and lots of sedges. But John thinks that this whole area, or at least a significant part of it, was a boggy, peaty, acidic, wet meadow. So quite different from today. A lot of the changes, especially after the 30s, came because of housing development on both sides and absolutely no control of sediment runoff from construction activities. So the soil down there is completely different now than it was before. So these are the 4 species that he found there that are bog-like in their habitats. 10-angled pipewort is by far the rarest. It's S1, which is the rarest category in the state system, highly state rare, not found in Sligo in 2003, in the pipewort family, which is new to me. And there's the sample that he collected. It's so rare in Maryland, I couldn't find a photo of it. So you see at the bottom, it's a photo from, well, I can't read it because of the, I think it's from Florida. There's another plant that he found either side of Forest Glen Road, American marsh pennywort in the ginseng family. Used to be in the carrot family. It's also a plant of bogs, seeps, and similar habitats. You see it doesn't have any state rank, but looking at the distribution map on the lower left there from the Maryland Biodiversity Project, you can see it is not easy to find. So I'd like to know more about that. Another one he found, seed box, which we do have in Sligo, in the evening primrose family. It was in section 7 and 9. That's from Forest Glen Road to Dennis and from University up. We also have it at the Powerline wetland at 16th place, which is just outside of Sligo. And it has appeared in the acidic seepage in the Powerline near Red Top Road, which I'll talk quite a bit later. It has these amazing seed cases that look they're made by a tiny carpenter. He also found Virginia meadow beauty in the Melastoma family. I think that's a heavily tropical family. When I was in Belize a year and a half ago, it seemed like a lot of the plants there were in the Melastoma family, which I wasn't familiar with at all. Wasn't in Sligo in 2003, but it is in this acidic seepage that was found in the lower power line. And in fact, that's the picture in the center of one of the meadow beauties in that seepage in the power line from last summer. So the second area outside of the center Tacoma Park, DC, is what Paul Stanley called the Sligo below Tacoma Park, and you can see that on the sample label there on the right. Presumably it was downstream from what's now called New Hampshire Avenue. I think then it was called Sligo Mill Road. And he must have covered a lot of territory because 3 of his specimens are labeled as coming from the mouth of the Sligo. Rod Simmons looked at, he's a botanist in Virginia, and a specialist in magnolia bulbs. He looked at the long list of sedges and he said these 5 rather, could be indicative of a magnolia bulb. Only one of them was in Sligo in 2003, and the other 4 were not. So here is Mr. Stanley. Like I said, many of these are from very rural areas. He's from Avalon, Missouri, agricultural area. He collected in Sligo in 1912 and 1915. He was a botanist at the U.S. National Museum, the State Smithsonian, for 20 years. He's known as one of the most prolific botanists that we've had. A very long list of publications. These are just a few from that era. Trees and Shrubs of Mexico, Flora of Panama Canal Zone, Flora of New Mexico, co-authored, and Flora of the District of Columbia. He was so well known. Well, he himself named 5,000 species, and he was highly regarded enough that other people named 3 genera and 222 species after. lower right there, later in his life, he's in Honduras. So what are some of the things he found that were indicative of, that could be indicative of a boggy environment? One is this fringe sedge, otherwise known as drooping sedge. His label says damp ground along the Sligo near Tacoma Park. All right, I sort of cheated on this one, but it was on the same day as all these other specimens that are all labeled below Tacoma. It was in Sligo in 2003, but only north of or upstream of Dennis Avenue. He also found swollen sedge, otherwise known as bladder sedge. He said it was in a wet field along the Sligo below Tacoma Park. This was not here in 2003. This picture in the center is really great because it shows the reproductive parts emerged from those capsules. Another long-leaved starwort, which, boy, it would be nice to see that. It's in the pink family, just like chickweed. He's described it as in a wet field along the Sligo below Tacoma Park. They're starting to sound a lot like the area around Forest Glen, but it's in the coastal plain, so it's a totally different geophysical province. It's a facultative wetland, meaning it can grow outside of wetlands. Here's another one that I put up a bit tentatively because there's a lot of seeming disagreement about the identity of this species, whether it's a species or variety. But I like the fact that it's called sand violet. Made me think of the sand that's involved in these magnolia bogs. But he said he found it on a wooded hillside near the mouth of the Sligo. Again, we didn't have it in Sligo in 2003. Now, so we've covered those two areas, 2 miles north of Sligo, of Tacoma, and the below Tacoma all the way to the mouth. Like I said, the main draw where most people did not say they were going to those areas, but they were going to Tacoma, Tacoma, DC, Tacoma Park, near Tacoma, or near the Sligo, all kinds of vague references, but usually with the word Tacoma in them. Now, the Tacoma bog as a word we're applying it retroactively from 1918. He is well known today for having identified this as a type of habitat. It's now globally rare and state rare. There used to be dozens of them between Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Laurel, Maryland. And now they're scant few, but they're being protected. So he said in 1918 in his book called A Sketch of the Natural History of the District of Columbia, in treating the types of collecting grounds in the District of Columbia region, it's easiest to begin with an account of the most strikingly characterized areas. In the writer's opinion, this distinction clearly belongs to the white sand and gravel bogs or magnolia bogs. They're fringed or dotted with shrubs like sweet bay magnolia, bayberry, swamp azalea, sheep laurel, dwarf huckleberry, northern hibiscus blueberry, possum hawk, and northern wild raisin, among others. He further says around the bases of the shrub colonies are deep cushions of sphagnum, in which grew some of our showiest orchids, as I mentioned, which are probably a big draw for these collectors. White gravel and sand are flushed with clear, cool spring water, which grow algae, lycopods, Utricularia, which is a carnivorous genus, I think, sundews, which are also carnivorous, and a couple of others. So he mentions in that previous quote a long list of shrubs there in the lower left, and of those, 4 of them were found in Sligo during this period. They're not exclusive to magnolia bogs, but nevertheless, if people went there hunting for the bogs, they might have found these there. There's the high-bush blueberry, although the collector says it was on dry ground northeast of Tacoma Park, so probably not the bog. Wild raisin in Sligo, A.S. Burgess, who we'll learn about later. On the upper right, the sweetback magnolia, and my screen is hiding the label of that one in the center. That's the swamp azalea in just Tacoma. There's your typical label, Tacoma, in the lower right. So what was the Tacoma bog probably like? Well, McAtee gives a detailed description of the powder mill bogs, which are were the best developed at the time, and clearly his favorite. But he says here this gives you an idea of why 40 botanists could come to Sligo. The aspect and plant associations of magnolia bogs are unique in our region and make these areas the objectives of pilgrimages by devotees of all branches of natural history. So not just botanists. Magnolia bogs form where a surface layer, usually of coarse white gravel or of gravel and sand mixes, underlaid by an impervious layer of clay and flushed by a constant flow of spring water. These are provided by Rod Simmons. These photos, this is from Bear Branch Magnolia Bog in Carroll County. You can clearly see the mixture of sand and gravel. Underneath is the clay that prevents the water from percolating down and creates the boggy, low nutrient environment. There we go. So there are a number of plants that are in the collections that could have come from the bog, and we have better reason to think they do than the very vague labels. And here's one that was from 1876, one of the very first of plants collected in Sligo. He labeled it, as you see in the lower right, as coming from the Sligo swamp. Now, the word Sligo in that era could mean a neighborhood. It could mean the train stop, or it wouldn't have been or usually the creek itself is identified as the Sligo, but you don't really know. It's very hard to tell. And also as Rod Simmons has explained, back in those days, the words swamp, marsh, and bog were used interchangeably, even by scientists. So this American climbing fern is a Maryland-threatened S2 state rare species. It was found by J.W. Chickering in October of 1876. He taught a field called natural science at the Washington Deaf Mute College, of course, now called Gallaudet University. It's rare enough that I could only, well, I could find a few photographs on the iNaturalist or the Maryland Biodiversity Project, but not many. Like I say, it's state S2 state rare. There's another, where did okay. There's a reason why there's no specimen on this slide. This is was identified as being seen at a sphagnum swamp near Tacoma, bog witchgrass, Dicanthelium lucem. This is another plant that has been identified many different ways. And the reason there's no specimen is that it's reported in one of the many 6 updates or additions to the flora of 1881 that I mentioned by Frank Ward. And in the 4th list of additions, he mentions that these 2 botanists, Scribner and Kearney, reported seeing bog witchgrass in Tacoma at the sphagnum swamp. And there's a couple of examples on the right, including the habitat. Now, it has no state ranking, but you look at the Maryland Biodiversity Project distribution map, and you see there, it's not found in very many places. So I'd be interested to know if that state ranking is going to be changed at some point, or maybe it's very abundant in those spots. There's another label that's suggestive. Well, we saw this much earlier, a sandy swamp near Tacoma Park, DC. This really sounds like the place. Arctic reed grass, also known as small reed grass. Homer House, August 1904. Not in Sligo in 2003. Not ranked by the state, and you can see it's got a pretty good distribution. Most of the photos I find of this are from the Eastern Shore. And there's the specimen. We'll learn more about Homer House a little bit later. Another that could have been collected in the bog, the label says bog near Tacoma Park, DC. And when you'll see later that the one likely area for the bog is in fact in the DC part of Tacoma. Slender yellow-eyed grass. I'm assuming it wasn't seen in Sligo. I didn't indicate that, but. So the question is, where could this Sligo bog actually have been with such vague descriptions that we have to work with? John Parrish was talking to me last summer about the headwaters of all the different tributaries to Brashears Run or to Sligo. And when I talked about that with Jim Douglas at Historic Tacoma, he pulled out this map, and I have it as 1910. Someone else says it could be 5 years, 6 years earlier. So this is the sewer map, storm sewer map of Tacoma Park from that era. And interestingly, they didn't bury the streams, or maybe they did, but for some reason they kept the map. They kept the routes of the exact routes of the street, the little tributaries themselves. So the red circles are the headwaters of these. The street names have changed. This Chestnut Road you see here with the number 11 is, that's Piney Branch Road now. And Oak Avenue is Cedar. So Jim was telling me that he knows somebody who lives up in this area, and or maybe it's this one, that his basement is constantly flooding. So the spring is probably still active. The topography, though, is topography apparently, according to John, is not quite right for a magnolia bog. Not sufficient slope, but it's still perfectly possible that there were wetlands of some kind there before the town was fully developed. So John explained another possibility to me for where the Tacoma Bog might have been, and that instead of the headwaters of Brashears Run into Sligo Creek, it would be the Tacoma Branch. Now, many of you probably aren't familiar with the Tacoma Branch. A lot of it's in Prince George's County. On the upper right is where the Tacoma Branch merges with Sligo Creek, right at East-West Highway there. The first red square from the right is it's not daylighted, but it has not been piped. It's free flowing, and that property is owned, half of it by the Prince George's County and half by Prince George's Park and Planning. And then it's above, the stream is above ground, goes through Pepco property, and then under New Hampshire Avenue. And the second square is now owned by Montgomery Parks, and they're going to be helping out. They've already done some regrading and planting of the upper part of the sort of the little stream valley. Then it goes underground, and it's not above ground at all from there on to that headwaters. Now, John says that historic headwater basin of Tacoma Branch is inside this, more or less inside this left circle, red circle on the left. Now we're gonna zoom in. Well, why might it be there? Well, both sides of Kansas Avenue from North Capitol to Eastern and around the Lamond Recreation Center is were probably the headwater basin of Tacoma Branch. There's a 200-foot elevation at the ridge between the Tacoma Branch watershed and the Piney Branch, which flowed to Rock Creek. It's a half mile from the Lamond train station, which I pointed out. So it's very easy for botanists to get there. There's a road nearby called Sandy Spring Road, which indicates the kind of geological conditions were conducive. And John's visited the area and noticed that on one street, the unit block of Underwood Northwest, extensive groundwater seeps at the base of a yard along the edge of the street still, and stain of iron-laden groundwater precipitate on the curb, sidewalk, and the street. In addition, if it were there, well, let's just say that this location is only 1 mile from two historic bogs at Brightwood and a historic bog, a big bog complex at the Terracotta Works, where Fort Totten Station is now. So we're zooming in here on that neighborhood. Lower right is New Hampshire Avenue. Upper right is Montgomery Parks property now, where above which the branch goes underground. In the center, Lamond Recreation Center retains the name of the old B&O Railroad station. Underwood in this red box is where the evidence of ongoing seep can be found. In the upper left is where Sandy Spring Road is. So here's the historic map of that area from, oops, I didn't copy the label. I think it's 1870s. You see the Le Mans station where the upward pointing arrow, and directly to the right of that, inside that green circle, you can barely see the blue lines of the Tacoma branch. The Sandy Spring Road name indicates, like I mentioned, that the geological conditions were conducive, and lots of gravel and sand overlaying impervious clay. So we're going to wrap up here by just looking at a few of my favorite botanists from that era who I encountered in doing this research. Homer House, born in Kenwood, New York, was at Columbia University, then came to the U.S. National Museum and the USDA. He was only in the DC area for 2 years, but he visited Sligo 10 times. Again, he might have lived nearby. He was a specialist in morning glories, and he became very well known by publishing this book of color photographs of wildflowers of New York in 1919, color photographs. So he was a very ingenious fellow. And in the upper right, you see his contraption for photographing plants without yanking them out of the soil and putting them in a pot. So he says here, few subjects present as many difficulties to the photographer as do wildflowers. I would take violent exception to classing them as still life subjects. Most of them exhibit more uncontrollable motions than a 4-year-old child before the camera for the very first time. So he was using a process called autochrome, invented by the Lumiere brothers in France. He had found that he had to have a background for the plant in order for the colors not to all get mushed together in the final image. He needed the cage to control the wind because the exposures were up to 20 minutes apiece on a cloudy day. And he was determined to take these pictures without pulling the plant up from the roots. So here I think the photo in the upper right might have been colorized later. That's because you see it many places in black and white, but there you can see his contraption under the heavy black plastic rubber is the camera. It looks very much like a portrait camera from that era with the hood. And this contraption of his lets light in, but keeps the wind out. And the background, the white background, enables him to focus on just those colors and nothing that's around it. He was very proud of the fact that this whole thing was collapsible and could be carried from one place to the other. So here are 4 of his, these are photographs. These are not, when I first saw these, I thought, okay, these are hand tinted like old postcards, hand tinted in color, but they're not. These are the actual color photographs using the Lumiere autochrome process. And you can see the earth that they're in is still there. And this book he published is massive, and it came out only 4 years after the first major book with color photographs. But these are all in New York State. So here's a few of the things he found in Sligo. Narrow-leafed sunflower, also called swamp sunflower, was not in Sligo in 2003. We only had one helianthus species, the Jerusalem artichoke. Virginia bugleweed is another he found in a low woods in Tacoma Park. We did have that in Sligo in the wetlands above Forest Glen Road. Above Forest Glen Road up through Kemp Mill in wetlands, and there's this tiny flowers. I think it's a mint. Now here's one he found that it's not, according to the Maryland Biodiversity Project, it hasn't been determined whether it's native or not, but I wanted to include it because he was a specialist in morning glories. He found it in a thicket along a road in Tacoma Park. We have a little colony of it at the corner of Wayne and Sligo Creek Parkway on the northwest corner. Now, with the purple line going through, it may be history. In fact, it almost certainly is history, but I haven't had a look. Second guy I wanted to highlight, Lester Frank Ward. He was born in what was then a very small town, Joliet, Illinois, survived the Civil War. got a federal position of some kind in 1865. 10 years later, he collected once in Sligo. He collected the book I mentioned at the top of the whole program, Guide to the Flora, Washington Vicinity, published by the National Museum. And he was in this area from 82 to 1905, working for the Geological Survey. But the reason I'm drawn to this guy is that he was a true polymath. In addition to being a top-rate botanist and one who could pull together all these botanical experts to publish this book in 1881, he was the first president of the American Sociological Association, a leading progressive voice of that era. And he did considerable battle in journals, newspapers, and speaking against Herbert Spencer, who was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest, twisting Darwin's views into how human society should be run. So he was battling Spencer on Spencer was a British. And so here's a historic marker from his, not from his hometown, but where his family at one point lived. He lost his father at an early age, and he did a lot of carpentry work here. Myersburg, Pennsylvania. His brother was a labor historian. Hub factory, I think, has to do with wagon wheels. And at the time, he was called the American Aristotle, which is pretty high praise. But seeing this made me think that Tacoma Park might want to adopt Lester Frank Ward as one of their own, not only because he collected plants here, but because he embodies a lot of the values that Tacoma Park cherishes. Here's his big book on botany. And I love this one. He has a very long introduction that's quite interesting to read. The whole thing is about 250 pages. It's a significant publication. But he says here, in many respects, the botanist looks at the world from a point of view precisely the reverse of that of other people. Rich fields of corn are to him wastelands. Cities are his abhorrence. And great open areas under high cultivation he calls poor country. While on the other hand, the impenetrable forest delights his gaze, the rocky cliff charms him, thin soiled barrens and boggy fens and unreclaimable swamps and morasses offer him the finest land in a state. And boy, you can't put it more straightforwardly than that. Here's the two plants that he collected somewhere near in Sligo, cinnamon fern in 1876. We do have it in Sligo at the west bank of the Kemp Mill stormwater ponds. They're actually, I don't think, fed by the ponds, but a seep uphill to the west where you see a lot of, I think, New York fern or something else. So that's a product of a dramatic seep. The second guy I want to profile is E.S. Burgess, from another small town, Little Valley, New York. Now, he became very successful and highly regarded. He taught at Hunter College for 30 years, but he was in DC teaching at a high school for 13 years. It was called Washington High School then it became Central High School. Now it's called Cardozo. But he taught this a class, and he, just a second here. It was extremely rigorous. He said, before they could take botany, it says here, botany in Washington High School is made a study of the third year. The student's previous scientific work has been a first year physiology, physical geography, and geology, second year physics, and optionally chemistry. The method pursued in the study of botany is primarily objective and based on actual examination of the appropriate material. The aim of the course is double: to promote habits of close observation, to secure knowledge of the life of plants. It is intended not merely nor principally to impart instruction, but rather to lead the student on to learn from nature direct. This is great championing of fieldwork or field botanists. Use of textbooks as a summary and for reference is considered an appropriate supplement. And he says fieldwork is deemed of vital importance, especially in promoting familiarity with habits and associations. You could see in the lower right, he discovered 84 species of asters, in his career, but he came to Sligo. One of his students, J.E. Benedict, was born in DC, but seems to have grown up on Forest Glen Road, just to the west of a watershed boundary between Sligo and Rock Creek. He ran a seed inspection company first in downtown Washington near the, I think he was kicked out to build the FBI building, but I might be wrong about that. His company was in that general neighborhood. He was a student at Washington High School, and he collected plants from an early age, age 16, and some of them are in the University of Maryland herbarium, but they were all from Rock Creek watershed. So we're not going to look at them here, but still, he was a precocious guy. And walking through what became Silver Spring, he said this, but he said, on the stone wall built around a spring on the Noyes estate in the new subdivision of Woodside Park, the writer discovered in the fall of 1922 a thriving plant of southern maidenhair. And he got that published in the Fern Journal. In the upper right, I include this because you can see that the flora of the District of Columbia at Smithsonian began as part of the collection was drawn from the herbarium of Washington High School. They had their own herbarium. So here's a couple of plants he found in Sligo, which are typical of bogs or wetlands. Northern wild raisin. This is one of the vaguer labels. In Sligo, Maryland, ? Likely. And let's see, I'm pretty sure we didn't have that in Sligo in 2003. Canadian serviceberry he found. He called it Sligo Park, which is really odd, 1893, maybe because it was park-like. It's a tree of wetlands, not in Sligo in 2003. And last but not least, Agnes Chase. She was from a small town in Illinois. She also lost her father at an early age. Biographies of her, the obituaries of her, refer to his father have been lynched, presumably in a time or place of anti-immigrant fervor. So she moved around a lot as a young person, ended up in Chicago at the Field Museum, a talented illustrator, and got hired to illustrate plants. In 1905, she was hired by the USDA, and she collected in Sligo first in 1905. And the left there, later in her career, she's on a collecting trip to Brazil. In 1918, she was, this is where Tacoma Park comes in, she was arrested with the Women's Party for a suffrage strike and joined the others in a hunger strike, making national headlines. One of her biographies says this: a strong sense of social justice, perhaps triggered by her impoverished early life. She belonged to the Women's Party, the Socialist Party, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, interesting combination there of bedfellows, and the early NAACP. She went on a hunger strike while in jail at the Occoquan Workhouse, it was called, part of the Lorton Reformatory. According to the obituaries, the USDA officials ordered her fired for conduct unbecoming of a government employee. But A.S. Hitchcock, who you saw earlier, the distinguished gentleman in the light suit and the goatee, he was her boss. He was a renowned botanist. He refused to fire her, and he was at the Lorton Reformatory when she was released. This picture here is taken a year before a previous demonstration. So what did she collect in Sligo? Another specimen of bog witchgrass, which is a bog obligate species. She said it was in the District of Columbia, Tacoma Park, which would fit with John's theory about where the bog was. She said it was in a wet spot in the woods among Acer rubrum. That's red maple, which used to be called swamp maple. Now on the right, the only reason I circled all that is to show you how after a specimen arrives at the herbarium, it's reviewed every few years or every few decades to see if the idea is correct. And there's so much disagreement over what to call this grass. Those are all the updates. And the Smithsonian's own spreadsheet on this species gets it wrong or doesn't agree with the people who evaluate it here the most recently. So I said I'd end with some good news to counter all the plants that used to be here that aren't anymore. And that's that last summer, a new enthusiast for the area, Casey Harless, it started investigating the power line and reported on a whole bunch of boggy type plants coming from this site circled in red. It's between East-West Highway and that little road, Red Top Road. Just for reference, on the lower left is where the Tacoma Branch goes under New Hampshire Avenue. So I took this picture in the fall. Here's the acidic seepage wetland. That's cinnamon fern turning very cinnamony. And you can see how it lays in the landscape. Pepco has let it grow out, but they don't give it as much a birth as it deserves. And we're hoping to find this growing season some plants in there that will force a DNR to require Pepco to fence it off, which they've done for another bog up above the Beltway in the very same power line, but who knows? So like I mentioned, Casey Harless first reported it. John Parrish did an inventory for the late summer and early fall plants. And here are some of the bog type shrubs that he found, or plants, sorry: red chokeberry, swamp dewberry, common winterberry, seed box, Virginia meadow beauty, vervain thoroughwort, or rough boneset. And on the right, you see Casey's photo of the red chokeberry. I took this photo of the sphagnum moss in that same site. So for those of you who are really knowledgeable about wetland obligate plants, it's a nice long list that John came up with. This is a subset of the full list of plants, which most of which are what they call wetland facultative, meaning they can survive in and thrive in wetlands, but they're not required to. And on the right here is a dose of reality. You see the next to last plant on the list, marsh fern. Casey got a nice photograph of it last summer, but there it is growing out of an abandoned tire. So I want to thank just a few people for helping me tremendously in this whole thing. John Parrish, French Slave Creek, Rod Simmons, Maryland Native Plant Society, and a Magnolia Bog expert, Laura Mall, for really helping me figure out how to make best use of Excel spreadsheets. Jim Douglas from Historic Tacoma, a nod to the memory of Claire Garman, who created the original web version, and then these institutions, which deserve a lot of thanks for preserving all these plants. And the Maryland Native Plant Society list at the bottom, there's an iNaturalist project. If you want to find plants just in Maryland, any plant, it's devoted entirely to that within the boundaries of the state of Maryland. So we'll look for questions now. I think John's got his camera on to perhaps point out a handful of things I got wrong through this. We don't know, but he'll be able to answer your questions as we go along. So thanks very much.
So with that, we will open things up for questions. So I think if you have a question, then raise your hand, and then we will call on you and open it for discussion.
Well, I can help by asking John if he wants to expand a little bit about the idea that Tacoma Branch headwater basin on either side of Kansas Avenue. What led you to think of that, since it's so far degraded from its long ago condition? What led you to look at that?
Well, I thought that it would be in the upper part of the watershed. It would have to be because the District of Columbia portion in Tacoma Park is all in the headwaters of the streams that feed Sligo. So that was easy. And the often these bogs occur right near the beginning of these tributaries that feed, that flow down into a larger stream system. So, in this case, Eastern Avenue was kind of my general guide. to think of that. So and unfortunately, so much of the Tacoma Park built up, and all the tributaries are piped underneath the streets now. So there's really no evidence to go by. So I started driving around and ended up on Underwood Street near Lamont Recreation Center off of Kansas Avenue. And the whole street there on the edge is just an extensive seepage zone. And, and with the iron stain, often the clays that underlay the sand and the gravel are rich in iron, the red clay. And when the water flows through that, it causes staining. And there's one other place that I've seen that staining in the watershed, and that's at Red Top Road. You mentioned Red Top Road by the power line. When you're at Red Top Road and the power line, you'll see the stains all along the curb there and the seepage water coming out there. And there's bog plants there as well. So anyhow, that's what made me investigate the DC portion, because so many of the labels in the Smithsonian refer to Tacoma, DC for all these bogged plants. So that's a very limited area to narrow things down. Unfortunately, there isn't any natural habitat left at all, but the soils and the hydrology are still there in these residential neighborhoods. The soils still underlie, still occur there, and the water still falls down and goes into the soil. So, the water has to come out somewhere. And so, and especially in the rainier times of the year, that's a good time to go look and actually observe and see where the water is seeping out of the ground in these yards. And most likely, those places were springs and seeps, and many of which probably had sphagnum moss and bog plants in them one time. One last thing I would say is that while there is probably a destination for the Tacoma bog, which was a hot spot for these plants, usually these areas are zones that are filled with lots of smaller wetlands as well in that area. And so, the boggy habitat probably, it wasn't restricted to one site. There was probably lots of little bogs all along that area, stretching up, including the headwaters of Brashear's Run that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, great. Catherine Tunis has a question in the chat. Says, around our houses, plants pop up that are not planted, but natives from pre-house days. Do you want us to take pictures for documentation? You might be able to find some lost species. And then the second part is the sweet bay magnolia a bog plant? My neighbor tells me she has one. And then after that, we'll go to Richard Hall.
John, that's definitely a question for you.
I missed the first part, but the latter part, yes, sweet bay magnolia. In the wild, it's typically a plant of acidic wetlands and bogs in our area. So that's you can grow sweet bay magnolia in drier soils, but if it's reproducing from seed, it will never, it's very unlikely that the seeds are going to germinate in a dry site. The reason you see these landscape plants is the plants were transplanted already with an established root system, into a drier location. But in the wild, 99% of the time, you're going to find them in wetlands. I missed the first question, though.
The first part is about pop-up plants that were not planted but just kind of showed up. Do you want to have pictures of that for documentation to see if it's a lost species that may have volunteered?
What pop-up plants are you referring to?
I was just going to add in while we're waiting that in looking at these old documents and specimens, the magnolia, sweet bay magnolia or sweet bay was at one time called swamp magnolia.
I guess they're just random plants that show up around her house and she's not sure what they are.
It's
Does it
one of the plants you might think that I would think of. There's a lot of different kind of sedges that pop up all around my yard at the least, and I've seen them other places that I've not. I mean, I've planted some, but these are ones that just pop up. So that's sort of the and those are a little tough to ID for us mere mortals.
I would suggest that you take a photograph when the fruits and the seed heads, the spikes of the sedges are fully mature.
Yeah.
And then I know Michael, I don't know whether Michael's still doing this, but through iNaturalist, I've been identifying plants for Michael through that for quite some time.
Right.
So, we'll take a stab at it. I can't guarantee that we're going to identify all of them, but many of them I can identify by photographs.
Okay, cool. Richard, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yes, thank you. Fascinating history. I'm just wondering if there's any way to restore to a magnolia bog, to restore or encourage, reestablish a bog like that.
I would say yes. And one great place to do it would be in the seepage, the acidic seepage under the power line that Michael referred to. And that area there, while it does not have magnolia, I know that it would support magnolia. And maybe at one time it did. And it's just been decimated because of Pepco in the past, cutting the trees down and using herbicides and things like that. But the habitat is conducive to support it.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can you get grants to do like that, or is that? I mean, how would something like that happen?
First, you need permission from Pepco, and
Good luck.
And then, after you get the permission, it would help if Pepco recognized how nice the habitat is, so that they wouldn't mow through there, with their bush hogs or spray herbicides. And that's happened in other places, but as Michael's pointed out, those other places that have been fenced off have rare plants in them and in the bogs, and that's what's kept Pepco from harming those places. So I'm hoping to go back this growing season and see whether I can find something rare.
Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Thank you. Jim Douglas, you're next.
Great. Michael, great. Since we talked a while ago, you've come a long way. That's super. But I'm going to disagree about the idea about where the Tacoma Bog is. That is not the Tacoma Branch watershed there. The Tacoma Branch comes out of Spring Park at Elm and Poplar. It's very clear where that water comes from. The site that you're talking about on Underwood is an old terracotta sewer pipe plant that was in active operation at the time these people were collecting. There was nothing going on there that was natural. It was all dug out and huge beehive ovens creating terracotta sewer pipe. So that's not what was going on in that area. Need to take a relook at that site. And I've spent a lot of time going over that, walking it, looking at the maps, following the history. I know that site. That's not a bog.
Yeah, it prior to all the clay works and all that.
Clay work started in the 1870s.
I know. I'm saying prior to the 1870s, all that probably supported bog.
But that's not when these people were collecting.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how extensive.
They were not collecting it when that was an active terracotta sewer pipe factory.
How extensive did the terracotta works go all the way up to Eastern Avenue?
Yeah, Absolutely.
That's quite large. I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you're, just to be clear, Jim, you're not talking about the terracotta works at what's now Fort
No,
Todd.
no, that's completely different. Le Mans Terracotta Works were at Le Mans Station. That's why it's called Le Mans Station. He bought that land and started his terracotta work before Tacoma Park was established in the late 1870s. So that was going on. That was a very active industrial site. There were no, that was not a wild area for people to be collecting in, at the time period that Michael's talking about.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah,
So-
and I'll just say there've been, in the advertisement, I said it, under active speculation as to where the bog was. And I know that Rod Simmons, who's spent a lot of time in Magnolia Bogs, he talks about the whole area on the border between Maryland and DC, and Blair Road and the Blair Mansion and areas near there. And there was Lou Aronica was a very active researcher in this area too, passed away. He found this kind of sand, pebbly strata overlaying the clay while doing some landscaping work in Tacoma, DC, in a neighborhood. I don't know exactly where that was, but I think the geology was, from what I gathered, pretty widespread.
So, yeah. So one of the things to think about, Blair Road is also a ridge line. So on the east side of Blair Road, the water goes to Sligo. On the west side of Blair Road, it goes into Piney Branch and down into Rock Creek. So it's when these people were talking about Tacoma Park, DC, they could have been talking about the west side of Blair Road. And those streams are really obliterated. We don't have any good evidence of where those are. But there could have been stuff that was flowing west down into Rock Creek rather than flowing east into Sligo. So something to think about.
Hi, this is Catherine. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I'm looking at a map now, Jim, and I don't want to go against anything you might have known, but as I recall, the Tacoma branch goes back and goes south, and the spring at Spring Park is almost directly, well, I shouldn't say it's directly north, but I know there's some ridges there, like around Tacoma Park South Neighborhood Park. Anyway, it would be good to look at this with a one of those maps that shows the elevations to see exactly where that's coming from.
Well, I'll just say, Catherine, you can walk it. You can start at the spring and it goes under Spring Street and then it goes into Circlewood and then it's very clear. And then it goes into the
Okay.
open area and then it goes down under, across New Hampshire and down across Red Top and so on. It's a pretty clear path from the
Yeah,
spring.
I know where that is, but it's just that I thought it always went out towards the south, like where the VFW is. But you're right. This will be an outing sometime this summer. We'll walk around there.
Yeah, the spring there clearly flows into the Tacoma branch, but the area along Kansas Avenue, west of Eastern Avenue, is also the headwaters of Tacoma branch. There's many headwaters.
That
Okay.
makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. And I guess our last question will be Mary O'Haran. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I put it in the chat, but my husband had asked if I would say this. Is there any plan to mark any of these sites so the public might learn more about them?
Well, I would definitely advocate for something, especially given how prominent the progressive botanists were, like Agnes Chase and Frank Ward. Fits in perfectly with, but since we don't know where the Tacoma bog was, it's really hard to say, you know, Agnes Chase collected plants here, or Frank Ward collected plants here. It's but it may never be possible, unless you by here you mean Tacoma Park generally.
Yeah, I suppose also it could be areas that might be of particular interest where different plants were found or are still. Anyway, thanks for everything you've said. It's been very interesting tonight. I'm very glad we were on it. But well, any little spot that would give, I mean, there's certain areas that I know are marked as areas that they're set aside for, you know, not being messed with, or, you know, they planted things or let it go back to nature. And so I think it would be kind of an interesting thing to see or even one of those kiosk things you have along the Sligo Creek Parkway. They have a little, there may be something there. I mean, maybe already be something there, but I haven't been able to walk very much in the last few months, or years, actually. Anyway, thanks so much. It's been a very enlightening evening, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, terrific. Great. Thank you very much, Michael, for the talk, and for John for all your hard work on this and your input. Thank you all for coming. To find out more about our upcoming events, visit our website, and this recording will be up on our YouTube channel at some point soon. And thank you, everyone, and good night.